Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. This episode is sponsored by Component One, makers of Widgmo. If you need stunning UI elements or awesome graphs and charts, then go to widgmo.com and check them out.
Don't panic, there'll be pay for most of us.
Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 86 of the JavaScript Jabber Show. This week on our panel we have Jamison Dance.
Hello, friends.
Merritt Christensen.
Hey guys.
Joe Eames.
Hey there.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. And this week we have a special guest, and that is Robin Ward.
Hello.
So, Robin, you haven't been on this show before. Do you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
Yeah, sure. My name's Robin Ward, as you mentioned. A lot of people know me by my alias Evil Trout, which I've been using for a long time. I'm a co-founder of Discourse, the open source forum software with Sam Saffron and Jeff Atwood. It's a Ruby on Rails, but also JavaScript app. Actually, GitHub classifies it as JavaScript, so I think it's like the majority now. I also previously worked on a web game called Forum Wars, which was moderately successful. It was like featured in The Onion and Wired and stuff like that. And yeah, I just love talking about JavaScript.
Awesome. So
do we.
Hooray!
Yeah, we should do that every week.
We should.
Yeah.
All right. So we talked a bit about Discourse. We've actually had 2 episodes about it on Ruby Rogue.
Yeah.
And yeah, it does sound like for the most part you're using Ruby on Rails to kind of provide the backend APIs and, you know, maybe a little bit of other functionality. And the majority of the stuff is in Ember.
Right. It's quite a big Ember app. I've heard, like, for a long time I used to wonder, like, is it the biggest Ember app in production? And but since then I have heard that there are a couple out there that are bigger, but it's like at least the biggest open source one. And
it's kind of the flagship one. It gets pointed at a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's like kind of like, for better or worse, considered a reference app. I say for worse because, like, I'm going to be honest, not all my code is the best code ever, you know, like, that I've ever written. So sometimes I think people look to it and be like, oh, this is the true way to do it, you know, when it's not officially blessed by the Ember people or anything like that. It's just like, we try to keep the code in the best shape as we can at any time.
Yeah,
but,
and it does seem kind of blessed by the Ember people, right? You'll have Tom Dale and some of those other guys sort of point to it a lot.
Yeah. I mean, the cool thing about it is because, you know, it's free and open source, and anyone could just jump in there and look at how it's made, which is kind of awesome because, I mean, if they're talking about, hey, this is how Ember works, you kind of have to learn from the tutorials yourself otherwise, unless you had something like this to look at. We were actually wondering recently, like, does Angular have an equivalent, you know, giant app? I know there's a lot of Angular apps in production because it's phenomenally popular, but I don't think they have the same kind of, like, open source large scale thing, so it's hard to get an idea of, you know, how a big open source Angular app could look.
Yeah, no, that's totally true.
So speaking of Angular, I know that a few people here tend to favor different JavaScript frameworks. What made you guys settle on Ember?
You know, in the beginning, when I was looking at them, I guess the big one at the time was Backbone. And I looked at Backbone, but I actually found like it did very little, which I've since found out is kind of like their philosophy. It's about, you know, we just give you a minimalistic tool set, you know, 1,000 lines of code, I think it was at the time, that you can just read and like get a grasp on yourself. But otherwise, you kind of have to roll it yourself. And I looked at the other ones. At the time, Angular and Ember were both very early on. And I think Ember sung to me because, you know, I came from a Ruby on Rails background. Forum Wars, that game I mentioned, was like 100% Ruby on Rails. And I really like some of the Rails philosophies, like convention over configuration and stuff like that. And Ember seemed a lot closer to that to me. So I also just like the way their templates worked and like how, you know, I looked at it, I'm like, oh, handlebars, that looks nice and simple. You know, I always thought like, it's a weird thing to consider, but like at one point I was like, what if I had to do some server-side rendering? Could I write my own handlebars interpreter? And it looks simple enough that I'm like, I could do that. With something like Angular that uses like DOM templates, I'd have to actually, you know, create a whole DOM environment using like Phantom.js to do the rendering and stuff like that. So I was like, this seems like a bonus, but mostly it was just a philosophical thing.
Sure.
And you guys have been using Ember since the very early days. There's been several rewrites of major portions of the framework. Can you talk about how you navigated those? I mean, you basically had to rip out the core of your app and update it to meet, I mean, thinking of the router change, and then there are also a bunch of changes once 1.0 hit.
Right. Okay, so Ember has had, I think there's been 2 major, I wouldn't say rewrites, but major changes to the router in the time that we've been using it, because we've been on Ember. Like, Discourse is approaching 2 years old from the time that I started with Jeff, and back then it was quite different. And I think when I started, there was actually no router in Ember. So we had to I actually wrote my own router, which is kind of a weird thing to do. But I guess if you're, used to a Backbone app and something like that, it wasn't that much code. But when the Ember router came out, I was like, oh, actually, this is a lot more sophisticated and we should change to it and put in an effort to do that. It hasn't always been easy, to be honest. The first time the router came out, I was like, okay, this is a different way of thinking about things. Let's just, restructure it. And I think it took about a week full time. The second time it changed, that was a fair bit of work. At the time, by that point, I was on, I guess, Yehuda and Tom's radar. So they were really nice and reached out to me and were able, to answer my questions over IM and stuff like that. So I got, I guess, first class support from those guys because they really wanted, an open source application to showcase what Ember could do. So.
Did you rage at them for screwing you again?
You know what? No, I actually didn't rage. They were extremely, I think, apologetic in advance because they knew what they were doing. But the thing is, the second router was unequivocally better to me. It was
so much better.
It is. So it's when they showed the code examples. Okay, so by that point, we had actually set up a semi-private Ember Discourse forum before Discourse was, even, I think, announced. And they were using it to discuss it. And they were discussing the new router there. And I'm like, oh, yeah. That's really the way it should have been. And I think if you're comparing something like Ember to Angular, one of the big difference is the router and the power and the way that the design that it works, the way that, they've implemented it. So I was on one hand, I was oh, this is going to be a fair amount of work. But on the other hand, I'm but once we're done, things are just organized so much better. So I couldn't really hate them for that. And again, it was a fair amount of work. That one took about, I don't know, a week and a half or 2 weeks. We really, really wanted to be on it. And it was coming out just at the same time that we were announcing Discourse. So I was okay, last thing I want to do before we go live is make sure we're on at least the most modern version of Ember. Since that, I would say they had a point release change to the router that added the asynchronous abilities, which is really awesome, but that didn't cause a major problem. If anything, it fixed some bugs that we had with the previous ones. So overall, I actually didn't find the changing APIs that difficult. I think other people were kind of frustrated because I think whenever there's a really new way of doing things and a framework is in, I guess, in active development, things are changing quickly and you have to make an effort to stay on top of it. And understandably, some developers get frustrated when things change underneath them and they have a bad experience and go away. So, but we stuck with it and I'm actually really happy with it.
So speaking of Ember being patterned after Rails, it sounds like they're patterning their development pattern as well, because it seems like the router in Rails is the part that always gets rewritten.
Could be. I think actually I think the reason that it happened in Ember is that the router is really a core piece. One major thing about the framework, one opinion, is that URLs are, what ties the web together. And I guess the piece of your framework that interacts with URLs is the router. So they wanted to make sure they got that right. And it's actually kind of weird. If you come, and this is one, I think, thing that's very confusing, is that if you come from a Rails background, a lot of the Ember terms are the same, but mean different things. And I guess that has to apply with your application being long-lived rather than short-lived. In a Rails request, typically, you go to a URL, the router loads up, it figures out what action you should go to, dispatches it, and does it. But in Ember, it's that page or view or what have you is going to stay around for a really long time. So the whole API around that and the concepts are really different. So I think it took them a long time to get right. There was also I don't know, other frameworks and stuff in the way their routers work aren't as focused around, like I said, long-lived objects and things like that. And they also, I think, didn't focus on the asynchronous aspect of JavaScript. Most of them were synchronous. So I think those two concepts alone were just really difficult to get right. And I think they made the right decision before the 1.0 release, just be willing to throw it all away and, start again.
I think you're right long term. That was a good decision, but I think it kind of lost some traction for them early game.
Yeah, that's fair. Right now by most, I guess, maybe by all metrics, Angular is more popular, and that could have something to do with it because they frustrated people early on with those kind of things. Personally, I'd rather have a really good API, even if it takes time. And they were very clear in the beginning, this is pre 1.0 software,
Yeah.
Well, it's also better if a framework is really willing to make changes to make it better. It really stinks when it causes problems for those with implementations, but if you can keep improving, then you don't become sidelined.
Right. I mean, I know some people, unfortunately, who have Ember like 0.9 apps, and they're like, well, we're not going to update it. But on the other hand, they're like, it works. It's not exactly the same thing as a server-side thing. Like, you don't typically get the same amount of security holes and things like that to warrant like a need to update frequently. It's more about, getting the features. But if you have everything laid out nicely and your application is working with an older version, you can support that for a really long time without having to worry about it.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. Have there been things that you've struggled with Ember? Things that have been hard to deal with? I mean, other than the fact that you've had things like the router change out from under you.
That's a good question. I mean, we really care about performance. When we were on the Ruby Rogues podcast, Sam spoke a lot about, the things he's done to Ruby to make it faster and Rails. And Ember, it's about trade-offs, right? But in some ways, I wouldn't say in some ways, almost always rendering on the client is slower than the server for like the same template. No, actually, I should qualify that and say, like, if you're rendering the same kind of thing over and over, it can actually be faster because you can send a small template to the client and it can keep re-rendering. But on any given amount of, string manipulation and stuff like that, like server-side applications can really just smoke a client-side one. And we always wanted our app to be fast. So we had to spend, I think, a fair amount of time making Discourse fast. And I mean, it's something that we constantly work on, and we work on both sides, the client and the server side. So I think like Ember is really easy out of the box. Well, sorry, really productive out of the box, I should say. But it makes it really easy to bind lots of things to one data structure. But sometimes that's not what you want, because with all those bindings add up to be, like a serious performance issue. So we spent a lot of time like learning how to make Ember fast and stuff like that. So I think that was a little bit of a learning thing. Also, it's just kind of a new way to build an app. Maybe some people don't consider it, but this was my first major browser application. And I think learning not to throw away data constantly, learning how to share things and make sure that you're using, a single reference to a single user object everywhere and stuff like that. That took a lot of learning as well. So those two things I think were the most difficult things for me.
So I'm just going to ask, because you talked about performance, how do you measure that?
Oh, okay. So we actually have, there's two ways. So I have an extension that I've built for Ember called Ember Render Speed. And I can find a link for you. But essentially, you just plug it into your Ember app, and then it gives you a little tree of how long it's taking all your views to render every time they render. And you can break it down by clicking on the tree in your console and expanding things. So basically, it gives you a milliseconds output for the raw rendering speed, and that you can try different things. The biggest optimization people can make is like unbinding bound things. So if you know that a nugget of data never changes, then if you unbind it, you get a much better performance. The second thing I did was I created the Ember Performance Suite, which is a series of really intense JavaScript operations on an Ember application that you can run in a browser, and then you can see how Ember's performing. I used that when I went and did my last round of performance improvements to Discourse. We were focusing on Android at the time because we found that Android is much slower than iOS or desktop. It's much slower than it should be. So I created this Ember Performance Suite so that I could test various optimizations to the Ember code base and then see how it performed in a wide variety of situations.
You mentioned earlier that in general you found that client-side rendering of templates is slower than server-side rendering. Do you have references or data for that? Or is this just from your personal experience?
Well, yeah, that's from my personal experience. You can look at how long it takes Ember to render a complicated view, and sometimes it's 100 milliseconds or something like that. Versus on Rails with ERB or even Haml, we see 50 or 30 or something like that. So,
Sure.
Again, it depends on the type of template and stuff you're doing. The client can make a lot of optimizations that the server just can't do because it's long-lived. But and when you're repeating a lot of things, one thing the server sucks at is, let's say you're sending a long table of HTML that's 100 or 200 rows. That's going to be hundreds of K, perhaps, of HTML that's generated. But if you have a template, you can just send a small handlebars template and then just the JSON data, which compresses really well, and then I mean, it can render a lot faster from that. Actually, I still say that rendering is probably slower. It's just the transfer from the server to the client is like a lot of that data is skipped. So it's a trade-off. You're like, I'm sending less data across, but it takes longer to render, but you still get a snappier experience.
Sure.
Have you run into any other performance issues or optimizations that are useful for Ember?
Besides unbinding things?
Yes.
I would say, well, Ember has this concept of views where essentially almost every time you make an if statement, or every time you evaluate a binding, or every time you loop through an each, or make an outlet, basically anything you put in the DOM is a set of these nested views. And sometimes you can actually create many more views than you wanted to by overusing if statements and each statements and stuff like that. Basically putting a lot of logic in your template. And if you have a lot of nested views, performance does go down. So that's another thing I keep an eye on is, how many views are we actually spawning for this? In some cases, we actually do we revert to raw rendering. And Ember actually has a really good capacity for doing this. Like you can, in any view class that you define, you can define a render method and give it a buffer and then push strings to the buffer. And it's much, much faster than if you're using handlebars with bindings. But the disadvantage there is that nothing is bound. So often what I do is I start by making a template and bind everything in the template and then make sure everything is working where it's nice and easy. And then once we're sure that the feature is stabilized and stuff like that, sometimes we'll take a step back and be like, well, let's override this template with raw rendering because maybe it's a button that exists on every post on the site, and then you're showing that 100 times. Those 100 times of rendering that button really adds up. So strings and raw rendering is much better in that case.
Got it.
So what kinds of things are you planning on adding to Discourse going forward that, specifically would be interesting to this audience?
That's a good question. Right. There's a couple things that are on my roadmap for the JavaScript stuff that I really want to work on. One is something that I'm working on right now, which is the ability to unload views as they go off screen. And that's something I'm just testing out now. Now, I don't know if this is too specific to Discourse, but to anyone who's used Discourse, our topics have infinite scrolling. And if you just scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll, it's actually adding a lot of posts into the DOM, and that can take up a lot of memory. So right now I'm working on a little widget to swap out views that are no longer on screen. Kind of like you guys might have seen this trick done on some sites with JavaScript where, sometimes there's large images and they only load once you scroll them into view. Now that's a bandwidth saving, but you can actually do the same thing for memory and performance if you keep track of the view. Now the disadvantage is that you have to keep track of the vertical height of that. But it looks like I have right now something pretty close to proof of concept, which would be like a view you could use in your Ember app or a class you could subclass. And then automatically when it goes off screen, it can unload itself. And then, use a lot more memory and presumably render less in the DOM to make the DOM scrolling faster. And then when it comes back onto the screen, then it'll do what it has to do. So that seems to be pretty effective right now, especially if you use things like infinite scrolling or really long pages.
Oh, I was just going to ask, if you are scrolling and while you're scrolling, you're removing things above you as you're scrolling down, how does that not change where you're scrolled to in the app? Or do you just leave an empty div that takes up space still somehow? Does that question make sense?
Yes. That's exactly what you have to do. So what I'm considering here is a post. So a topic is made up of many posts, let's say maybe hundreds or thousands. And once you've rendered a post, you know the height of it. So once it scrolls off vertically off the top, you can actually swap out that view with just with an empty div that has the same height that the view used to have. And then the scrolling stays in the exact same spot.
Sure, that makes sense.
And then when the view comes back, you reconstruct the view in Ember and all the bindings and all that stuff, and then render it right into the same spot. And it doesn't adjust the scrolling, like in my example. The only tricky thing is if you want to make a placeholder before you've rendered it, you need to know the height. So that's something I'm trying to figure out now. I think that can't be a swap-in thing. I think in some cases you can, maybe if someone's rendered it before, we could store that. And then, pull that back out of local storage or something like that, or maybe even store it on the server side. But that gets a little weird because different clients, I'm sure, are going to render different vertical heights and stuff like that.
That's actually a problem we've run into, yeah, where you're trying to calculate layouts and you don't know until you insert it how big stuff is. So I'd be really interested to hear about your solutions for that.
Yeah, it's actually a really small amount of Ember code right now for what it does. I think it's 30 lines, and it seems like a drop-in replacement for any view. But it's gonna take a little more work. But hopefully within the next week or so, we'll deploy some version of it and get it out there and let people try it out. The other thing that I want to work on that I think is really interesting is like kind of a more powerful identity map. So right now, just so we're clear, like a lot of Ember applications use Ember data, but Discourse does not. Discourse kind of, when I started programming it, the Ember data page said, Ember data is totally not stable, not ready for production. So that kind of scared me off. And I looked at what's involved in making an Ember application speak to a server without kind of a client-side ORM type framework. And it wasn't that much work. So I was like, so we just started using, raw AJAX calls, and it's lasted us this long. But there are certain disadvantages to not using Ember data, and one is the identity map. So I'm talking about the pattern where if I load a user with ID 1, and then another request wants the user with ID 1, it can just use the one that's in memory, rather than, going to the server and getting all that information again. Or if the server returns user ID 1 to reuse the same instance in memory of the user that was instantiated the first time. So Ember, I think, goes really far to make sure that you reuse the same objects. Like when you make a link in an Ember application, if you link to a route and you reference a user, for example, it actually passes the reference to that user through to the other route. It doesn't pass like an ID like other frameworks that tend to be, so if you said, I'm linking to this user, it would link to 123, and then that URL would then have to look up user 123 somewhere else. Like in an Ember app, by default, it just passes the user on through. So your route already has the same reference, which is really powerful. But it's not perfect, because you can't guarantee that every place in your application that would request a user is going to get a handle on the same one. So I'm looking at making like a lightweight identity map that I can use for this. Now, one problem with that, and it seems that most identity maps I've looked at in the JavaScript universe, never unload data, which is kind of a little weird because I guess traditionally it's not a major problem, but most of them will just shove, a key value kind of hash of objects. But most never think, let's unload the ones that haven't been used in a really long time. And I think that's one thing that JavaScript makes particularly difficult, because you can't tell when there are no more references to an object out there. So you either do, I've seen some people suggest things like do reference counting or something like that. So I want to make something with an API that's not insane, that can actually unload objects once you're no longer using them after a certain amount of time.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think Merrick's done some work on something like that. And I know one of my friends as well has done a cache for Angular that I think uses it's just least recently used caching. So if it hits the limit, it just kicks out stuff that it wasn't used in a while. But
yeah, mine
that's a whole can of worms,
reference
caching.
Yeah, it is. It's its own problem. Mine use reference counting, but the reference counting you could just hook into the framework, right? So when the view gets constructed and when it gets decomposed, and you change the reference counting. But I think if I were to go down the Angular route, I would look at that Angular-cache.
I'll definitely look at that. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's a tough problem.
It's really tough.
It's one of the hard problems in computer science, right? I'll get to do it in JavaScript, like everything else.
Yeah, because if you imagine that every post that every user uses on a Discourse site is thrown into an identity map, very quickly you'd run out of memory. If you stayed browsing the site for a long time.
So to what extent
does Discourse do right now?
Say that again.
I'm sorry?
I was just going to ask, what does Discourse do right now? Does it just throw away the data, or because you said it sounds like you're not using an identity map right now?
We don't use an identity map for most areas. In a topic, when you're in a topic has its own identity map of all the posts. But when you leave the topic, it throws all that away, because we know that you're not looking at, because posts are never shared between topics.
Sure.
So it works pretty well there, but it doesn't work as well with things like user objects or other kinds of data that are shared across the rest of the site. So that's more of a challenge there. But yeah, I'll definitely look at this Angular cache thing. That looks really promising.
So what I'm wondering is, to what extent is Discourse a single page app?
Well, first of all, if you don't mind, I don't like the term single page app personally, because I actually think Discourse, as you navigate a Discourse forum, the URL changes all the time. So I'm always well, we're kind of representing it as different pages. Why is it called a single page app? But that's just me being pedantic, I guess. Discourse is essentially 100% a browser application. When you first come to the site, it'll download this giant JavaScript payload, and then all the rendering is then done client side as you navigate all the URLs. There are a few cases where we don't use Ember. I think the reset password URL and the activate URL don't, because they're just like really simple things that don't need to load up an application for that kind of functionality. And then we'll also sometimes, more if you're an admin than like just a regular user, but we'll refresh the whole page to clear out the state. So like if you're editing categories on the site, it's actually easier for us to just say, reload this page and unload all the current data than it is to, manually figure out all the places that we've kept categories in our memory. But yeah, I think it's actually a really good fit for like a browser application, because forums I think have a different kind of use case for most users. Like, people don't generally come to it like a blog and read one post and then go away. They often like go to a forum and they read a topic, and then they go to the next topic and they read that one, and they go to another one. Like they stay around for a really long time. So you can take advantage of a lot of that persistence of objects and client-side rendering in those cases, because you're eating the upfront cost. Whereas if you're making something like a blog, you might not want to like send a giant ball of JavaScript down the wire just for rendering one page. That seems like a bit overkill. Like my blog actually is just static HTML. And some people are like, why don't you use Ember for your blog? And I'm like, I don't know. Maybe if it was like blog admin section or editing tools, I would consider something like that. But I think you really have to have a situation where you want to take advantage of something before you build a browser application.
So I'm going to kind of change the subject just a little bit. Ember has added some new stuff, right, since you guys started, like components. Have you guys made use of any of those things? What new Ember features have been like useful and interesting versus what ones haven't?
That's a great question. Well, besides the router, which we talked about, they added, there's two things that I really like about Ember. And one is, I really like the computed property macros, which is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with what a commuted property is, but it's essentially you can make a property on an object using Ember's object model and say this property is composed of these other properties. And it's essentially a caching mechanism that you don't have to worry about updating, because like if you say the area of a square depends on its width and height, then it knows to only recalculate the area when either the width or height change. Yeah. So the syntax of writing them was like always not that bad. Like you just said, this is the name of my property and it's a function and it's based on these two other things. But they added these macros for, kind of like similar to Boolean logic, but you could really easily write computed properties by just saying like, this is ember.computed.and or ember.computed.not and stuff like that to just, like shorthand for writing these properties. And then you can compose properties of other properties, and it's really efficient. I really like that.
Okay.
So I have a blog post that shows an example of how that works if you guys are interested. The other thing that I really like is components, as you mentioned. Now, Ember always had views, which are not like incredibly different than components are, but they kind of have a different way of, I guess the way they access the data is different. Like components are designed for reuse, and they don't want to. So how can I say this easily? Okay, like a view often is bound to the controller as well. So like if a view had a button in it and someone clicked on a button, it would be normal to say, hey, controller, the user clicked this button. So in that way, the view knows about the controller and the controller knows about the view. But a component is designed in a different way where you're expected to give the component all the data that it needs. And that's actually really powerful because it means that it's like not as tightly coupled to your controller, and it makes it easier to reuse. And in theory, it means that people can take a component from one Ember application and put it in another, because whenever you use it, you just say, hey, component, here's what you need to work, rather than
that's like a contract.
Yes. So it's kind of clever in the way that like this feature, we've been using views in Discourse for forever, like since the beginning, and using them we even use them as components. Like we had Discourse text field, which was like our custom text field that had, in our case, support for like I18N for the placeholder and stuff like that. Just a couple little attributes that we used. And that was essentially a component, but just as a view. So what a component does is it forces you to make sure that you're not, like the contract doesn't exist between the view up to the controller. And if it does, you have to explicitly state it. And that it turns out to be a really good idea. So we're a bit behind on that because this is something that came into Ember, really late, right towards 1.0. So we've recently started doing it. So some recent commits to Discourse have like sortable column headings, for example, and those are built using components. And I've replaced a lot of our previous views with components, and I think it's kind of just the right way to structure things. Like, it's starting to make me think that, views probably shouldn't know what controller they belong to, They should be able to exist outside of that. So it's kind of making me think that I should always push the references into my views, even if they're not strictly speaking components, just so that they can, maintain that like looser coupling.
Can you maybe talk about how the Ember idea of components maps to web components? Because it seems like the dream of web components is similar in that you can drop them into different apps and they just interoperate, but they're not tied to one specific framework.
Right. I'm not like an expert on this, but as I understand it, Ember components are built on the same philosophy as the web components, but they're not they're definitely not built up in the same syntax and stuff like that. Like, you have to use handlebars to use an Ember component. But I think the idea is that let's get started with the philosophies of web components and the ways that those should work now with Ember without having to, use complicated browser shims or, whatever compatibility layers you would need to get that to work today. And then later on, this should be a much easier upgrade to actually using a proper web component. So, but I think, I'm definitely not an expert on what the spec says about how those are supposed to work. It's pretty complicated. But I do know that the ones in Ember right now are useful today, and I think very clean, and I would always use them. Like, if I'm building an Ember application for any reusable kind of widget or thing like that.
So it sounds like they're trying to align them philosophically while the API is still being nailed down.
I think that's definitely the truth. But I do know, like I said, that the one thing I do know is the HTML web component spec doesn't use handlebars, to instantiate them. It has a different mechanism. So it's not going to be like the second that that's nailed down that all of a sudden Ember components, you could use them outside of Ember, So it's going to require but a little bit of a difference. But philosophically, it's I think it'll put people in the right place. And people who are using Ember components today will probably be more prepared for that kind of thing, I hope.
Now, if somebody wanted to just get started with Ember, what recommendations would you give them as far as where to get started and what kinds of things that Ember really lends itself well to?
Well, I think for a long time, the documentation wasn't great on the Ember site, but now it's actually pretty good. I would actually just start on the Ember site working through the tutorial. There's one where it's under getting started, where it takes you through building a whole application. And I often point people to that. I think there's a lot of good Ember tutorials out there on the web and stuff. To start there, I think Ember really shines when you're actually building an application rather than say something like a widget. Like I mentioned Backbone earlier, and I think Backbone is really well suited to doing things like if you have just a little iframe that has a little dynamic activity in it and stuff like that, you might not want to suck down the whole Ember dependency, which is quite big, right? Even minified and gzipped, it's quite a lot for just something small functionality. So it's really meant for an application, something that works in your browser that has advanced functionality, where you want the user to be around for a long time. I don't think Ember is necessarily a good fit for applications where people bounce really fast, come in, look at something and leave. It's really for people who are using your website for to do something awesome. So I would say if you have they say ambitious is the way they use it, but I just think anytime you have a sophisticated application that's going to have a bunch of logic, it's a huge win for that.
So the other question I have is, it sounds like you've been playing with Angular a little bit as well. Mm-hmm. When would you choose one over the other? And the other guys can chime in here too. I just curious as what your takes are on this.
That's a good question. I definitely think that more than people admit that it's just a kind of a philosophical difference between the two frameworks. Recently, there's actually Alex Machner just put out some slides comparing the two that I thought were really well done. Actually, that was going to be my pick for this episode, so I apologize for already blazing ahead on that. But yeah, it was a fantastic thing. And he basically said that Ember is advertised as a framework and Angular is not. Angular expects you to kind of build your own framework out of its pieces. So it depends where you're coming from and how you like things to work. I know a few Angular developers in the Toronto area who love it. And the one question I often ask them is okay, here's a question. I know how you've built your application in-house to your wants and needs and your domain and stuff like that. But how comfortable would you feel if you all of a sudden went to a different shop in Toronto and then had to work on their Angular app? Would you know where all the files are? Would you know how the application is laid out? And always they answer no, because you essentially have to come up with your own conventions, where Ember is really convention over configuration. So they're like, you will always know that the template is called this and the class is called this and the route is called that. So I think like it has that going for it. So really, like, it depends what speaks to you. Do you want to go in there and tinker and make it exactly as you want it, or do you like conventions and do you like knowing what to expect and things like that? So I personally would favor Ember in almost all cases, but I think there are probably some applications where Angular would probably be a better fit, just depending on what you're building.
Awesome.
I have a question. It's a wild change of topic.
Sure.
Where did the name Evil Trout come from?
It's not super exciting, actually. So I mentioned that I made this game called Forum Wars, which was like a parody of the internet. So it's like a role-playing game where you role-play an archetype of an internet user, like a troll or an emo kid or something like that. And you go on fake internet websites and own them for experience and stuff. So when we came up with that project, at the time I'd always had aliases in the past that never stuck. And I figured like this is a good opportunity to just create a new personality. So I just was like no single words were available. I wanted something that that wouldn't be taken on every single site. So I was like, obviously I have to go with 2 words. And I was just like going through multiple combinations in my head. And I don't know how I hit Evil Trout, but I just it just stuck and I've gone with it ever since. I just think it also makes a funny image. So if you guys can see my Skype avatar right now, it's like a cartoon version of a trout. And, a user of Forum Wars drew that for me, and I just really love the image that it portrays. Some kind of sophisticated trout, perhaps holding a sword with a mustache, or maybe sitting by a fire drinking some brandy because he's evil or something like that. I try not to actually be an evil person, despite the alias. I just think it's just a funny image.
Would the trout be like petting a cat?
Yeah, but the cat would have the cat would have a snaggle tooth and maybe red eyes or something. They have to. I actually think these days, a lot of people don't care about aliases as much as they used to, and I think they're this really fun kind of remnant of the old BBS days and community. I guess everyone has a username on Twitter, but a lot of people just use their real name. And I understand why they do that, because they want people to be able to find them by their name and stuff. But you lose that certain little that's his.
You lose the ability
cool way of identifying themselves,
So can we get an Evil Trout laugh out of you?
I don't know.
I just imagine this fish sitting in his chair plotting to blow up the ocean.
Yeah, that's
we'll
perfect.
blow up the ocean.
Unless you give me $1 million or something. I don't know, but
yep.
I like it, and it's stuck. And a lot of people know me by it. So I was at an Ember meetup in Toronto recently, and someone was talking, and someone's like, "Oh yeah, an Evil Trout," and someone's like, "Oh, you're Evil Trout?" He had met me as Robin. He just had no idea that's who I was. And I guess that's a downside of having an alias, is that a lot of people will just recognize you by the alias and not your actual name. But then I guess other people can't always remember it. Someone was saying on IRC recently, they're like, "Oh, do you read that blog about Ember by that guy? What's his name? Stinkfish?" And they're like, "You mean Evil Trout?" Yeah, that's him. So people get it wrong, just where they wouldn't probably get a username.
Isn't that a Tool song?
Your full name. Stinkfish? Maybe that's where it came from. I don't know.
I wonder if that's available on Twitter.
Good stuff.
Stinkfish? You can take it.
Quick, somebody register stinkfish.com.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, dang.
If you guys ever use IRC, there's this meme where it's someone slaps someone around with a large trout.
Mm-hmm.
And on Twitter, there's a bot that whenever trout is mentioned will, it's called slap trout or something, and it'll send you an @ message saying, "I slapped you around with a large trout." But it's super annoying because that means whenever someone mentions me or retweets me, it makes me susceptible to this thing. So I get hit by this thing constantly. Super annoying. First trout problems, man.
Awesome. So one other thing that I've been wondering about, and I've been wondering about this with Angular as well, but I guess that's a topic for another show. How do you manage the authentication and stuff? Because for most of the applications that I've built, a lot of that is managed by the back end. And so how do you keep that consistent between front end and back end?
You mean, well, for Discourse, it's not too hard because if there's basically 2 states. 1, you're logged in, or 2, you're not. So when we download the initial payload, we include a little bit of JSON in there. We call it preloaded data. So we'll sometimes include your user record. And if that's present, then, it's deserialized and we show all the logged in controls. And if it's not, then we show, the login buttons and all that stuff. So it's really just the response from the server handles whether or not you show the login state or not. An earlier version of Discourse would actually, log in using an AJAX call without refreshing the page or anything like that. It was kind of an awesome proof of concept because you can have a login button and it can log you in, and then all of a sudden the UI just adds all these controls that weren't there before because you're an admin or whatever. But we actually found that what I was talking about with binding before, just having all those if statements for logged in and stuff like that were really bogging us down if they were all bound. And the truth is the user state doesn't change that often. We actually don't want people to log out. Maybe when you're done, but you shouldn't be doing it frequently. Maybe you should log in once in the beginning and once at the end. So it's much easier for us to accept the whole, re-download of the whole page than it is to handle all those crazy bindings to hide and show controls just for the awesome show off thing where, you log in and everything changes.
The other question I have is, I was talking to a friend of mine at RubyConf, and he mentioned that his company had moved away from Ruby on Rails as a backend for their application. Incidentally, they are using Ember. And instead they're using Elixir, which is another language that is written on the Erlang VM. And so it has all of
so hot right now.
Yeah, and it has the concurrency and the fault tolerance and things like that you expect from something like Erlang. And so I'm wondering if the difference in performance and fault tolerance and things affect the front end as far as being performant, fault tolerant, etc., or is it really insulated from the back end other than just the way that it makes API calls?
I think it's really well insulated. I mean, in the Ember community, there's a lot of people who are using Node, for example, on the server side, or Rails is quite popular, I guess, because, YCats and some of the philosophies shared on that. But I even know a person who uses .NET on the server side. As long as you can spit out JSON and, consume REST kind of things, it doesn't really make a large difference. I think what you use on the server side, which I think is one of the strengths of Ember actually, is that it forces, or this actually is not specific to Ember, but any kind of, browser application framework, is that it forces you to make a robust server-side API. And you know that it's battle tested because you're the one consuming it every time your application loads. I've worked at other places where we were predominantly a website and we had an API, but if no one was using the API, we didn't, it was easy to introduce regressions and stuff like that, which is really difficult with a browser application. So yeah, I think that would actually be a good way to try out, a new server-side language if you have confidence in the client side. There are other advantages too. If you decide to build an iOS app or an Android app, you know that you have a JSON API that the developer can start using right away.
Yeah. That's one other question that I had for you that I had forgotten about, and that was that I'm taking advantage of some of the JSON APIs for Discourse to manage mainly registrations in Discourse. If somebody signs up for one of the forums that I manage, I just invite them to a topic or a thread. Have you found that those APIs are pretty accessible to people who want to integrate from another system like an iPhone?
They definitely are working, and I think most of them are pretty straightforward. Where I feel guilty saying that Discourse has an API is that, I think a big part of providing an API is that you have to document it, and you also have to maybe version it, or at least give them a guarantee that it's not going to be changing. And still, Discourse hasn't really officially hit 1.0 yet, even though we're, I think pretty stable these days. So I think, it's easy to use and it's easy to start using, but right now it's a little spooky because we're not offering the guarantee that we're not going to change some of those JSON layouts and stuff like that. So, for certain areas, I think it's pretty stable, but for others, you might just want to check with us first if you were going to build a giant application on top of it, because we certainly wouldn't want to screw you down the road when we make a change for something like that.
Mm-hmm. So there's no documentation that tells you where these endpoints are or how to integrate with them?
No, not for the most part. Right now, in terms of extensibility, we're really pushing our plugin infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So we were because this is one thing that I think all, forum software needs, is the ability for people to drop in a plugin and easily extend it. That's actually a huge advantage for a browser application, is because it's amazing how often you can introduce entirely new features without a server-side hook. That's always a gee whiz moment, when you're sitting down, you're I have this new thing to do, and you sit down, you're making the Ember thing, and you realize, oh, all those REST endpoints are actually still good for this entire feature. I can just add JavaScript. So from a plugin perspective, it's really awesome to be able to just say, here's some JavaScript, execute this, and now the forum does something different. And it doesn't just look different, but it might have a select all or something that didn't used to previously exist. So that's kind of what we're encouraging for that. But for people who actually want to access the database, yeah, it's a little riskier to just start using our JSON APIs. But I would think that, like we have a really active dialogue open with, any developer. If you make a post on our meta forum or a GitHub issue and say like, look, I want to build this awesome thing, or I'm doing this thing, I'm sure we can work something out so that we're not, giving you a world of pain in the future,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, I don't know if I have any other questions. Do the rest of you guys have more questions, or should we wrap up the show?
I just want to talk about the article, your blog post.
Which one?
Which one?
Your big one, the big controversial one, the one you mentioned earlier.
Right. That's probably like the most popular thing I ever wrote. It was like, I've had a couple things on the top of Hacker News, but that one, got hundreds of comments and, spawned like many a flame war and post like that. To me, I mean, while I was excited to get the attention, I was a little disappointed on like the kind of conversation that came around about it. I kind of regret writing it in a way, to be honest, because I feel like many of my other blog posts, had like really good technical discussion and stuff like that. But this one kind of just got the fanboys from both sides to come out and say like, no, you're totally wrong for X reason, or oh, you're totally right for Y reason, and stuff like that. And like, I just thought the discussion around it was like not as good. So like, yeah, you might get to the top of Hacker News and get, tens of thousands of requests for your blog by making something controversial like Ember versus Angular. But I would have much rather, like if I was to do it again, just been like, maybe here's one feature at a time, or like, look at how Ember does this really well, rather than a direct comparison. But I guess people wanted it, on the other hand. Like a lot of people are like, I've heard of building browser applications or front-end MVC, and I don't know which one to use. What reasons should I use X over Y? But I think it's just really hard to have that kind of discussion.
The interesting thing about the reaction is I feel like it didn't convince anyone from what I read about it. It was just people used it as a club, either for Angular or for Ember. They just
Yeah.
took it and were like, this guy doesn't know anything about Angular, or like, look how much better Ember is than Angular. I don't think the article is bad. I think the reaction to it was very, very entrenched.
Maybe the people that were contributing the conversation, none of them were convinced. But if anything, at least because it had so much popularity, you're going to get a lot of people that are going to see these two new frameworks on their radar. So if anything, that's good, and at least they'll check them out now.
Right.
I thought what was interesting about people's responses to the article was that they really just showed the different philosophical camps. Like the point you were illustrating is there is no blessed way. Like, I don't know what the model's supposed to be, etc. And then there's people going on there and saying, how dare you don't know how to use Angular. But that's because the philosophical ideals behind the frameworks are just different.
Right.
One is a framework, one is sort of a framework.
Exactly. I'm not aware of any like giant mistakes I made. There were some people who commented saying like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, you should do X. But then there would be replies to that saying, like, for example, the root scope. They were like, well, for doing what you're doing, you would just use the root scope. And then someone else replied, never use the root scope, and then, so I don't know, like, it's just, it kind of depends what you're looking for and how you want to build things. I've definitely seen really good apps built in Angular. I just think that, and again, philosophically, like out of the box, it doesn't answer as many questions. You have to determine your own best practices. And if your company can enforce certain standards of quality and certain ways of doing things, you can build extremely good and performant and really updatable and tested applications in Angular. And you can also write really bad code in Ember. Like, it's not immune to that either. So I think what I really just do is tell everyone to look at all of them and then consider what your values are as a developer. But the worst thing that can happen if you try Angular is that you like it and then you want to keep using it, or Ember. The same thing is true.
Exactly. It's a great point.
Yeah, some people, it's. I guess one thing is a bit weird is since I wrote that, some people are like, well, you obviously have a vested interest in Ember succeeding. And I've always thought that that's like actually not true. Although maybe like I'm just blind to it, but like Discourse is an Ember app. So obviously we want contributors to Discourse. So on that level, we want Ember to be successful rather than Angular. But the truth is that I'm really happy with the front end code for Discourse as it is today. And even if Angular gets more mindshare or whatever, that doesn't negate the fact that we have a really good code base, and it doesn't stop people from being able to contribute because it's JavaScript code and there's a lot of JavaScript developers out there. So I don't think like I'm biased in the way that, like, for example, maybe a framework creator or someone who works for a corporation who creates such frameworks could be. But that's just my side point.
Awesome. Is that it, Chucky?
Yeah, I don't have any other questions, so let's go ahead and do the picks. Joe, do you want to start us off with the picks?
I do. So, Robin, since you were talking about Angular best practices and where are they, I felt like this would be a great time for me to plug my latest course with pluralsight.com, which was be Angular best practices.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I'll pick that. That's like 5 hours of coursework, video coursework on pluralsight.com about Angular and best practices with Angular. I'm also going to pick the game Little Wizards, which I bought at the board game store, although it's actually an RPG. It's a tabletop role-playing game in the same vein as Dungeons and Dragons, but it's actually for kids. So it says on the cover for kids ages 6 to 10. I've got kids. I got a 9-year-old boy, and then I've got 3 daughters that are 11, 14, and 15. And I played a game with them on Sunday, and we played this game of Little Wizards, and my kids had so much fun. They each played a wizard, and they had to go through and figure out why the chocolate was poisoned and in this town, and they just had a absolute great time. So I'm going to pick the game Little Wizards. If you remember your glory days of playing RPGs, and now you have kids, and you'd like to introduce them to the fantastic world of interactive storytelling games and role-playing games, then Little Wizards is definitely for you. And then my last pick is going to be the coin. I just saw this on an ad on Facebook before, and I don't think I've ever been more excited about a geeky tech item. At least I haven't been in a long time. It's a credit card that it's literally exactly the size of a credit card, but you can actually use an app. They send you a little scanner that you plug into your phone. You use an app, and you can scan every one of your credit cards or loyalty cards or rewards cards or whatever. And then the app will, through Bluetooth, send the information over to this one card. And then now that card is every card that you own. And it has a little display on it, and you can flip through it, select the card that you want, then hand the card to the register or run it through the register, and it will run as the card that you chose. Just absolutely awesome. I mean, I don't think I've been excited. I pre-ordered one. They're not available till sometime next year. But right now they're $50, and next year, and they're only going to be $50 for like 2 more weeks, and then they'll be $100. So I'm actually going to put a link with my referral code because I get $5 if somebody buys one. Well, not $5. I get $5 off my order, my $50 order.
Wow, Joe.
Yeah, I'm totally.
Do you know if it works with? Do you know if it works with like the RFID things that are in cards these days? Like I tap my Visa a lot these days rather than swipe.
No, it's not like it does. It's not like RFID or NFC. It's just for when it's actually you need to run the magnetic strip. And it's cool. It has has a Bluetooth connection to your phone, so that if your phone gets too far away from the card, like you forget it and leave it, then the card deactivates, so that nobody can use your card when you're not around. It was really cool. So the video, I watched the video. I was so excited because I have this huge wallet, like the George Costanza wallet, and it's so thick, and so I was so excited to get rid of that stupid thing.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, Jameson, what are your picks?
I have 2. One is a free book that Carlos Bueno, he's an engineer at Facebook, just put out. He's amazing. He did Lorem Ipsum, I think, which was like a children's book that is also full of computer science parables. It's the nerdiest thing in the world, but it's so cool. And this book is called The Mature Optimization Handbook. So it's kind of a play on the premature optimization quote by Donald Knuth. And it's just a really detailed and easy to read breakdown of how you go about optimizing things. It's kind of focused on server-side stuff, but it's general enough that you can apply it to client-side stuff. And he does a really good job of breaking down myths about performance optimization. It's just been a fantastic read, and I have like a giant nerd crush on this guy, so I love that he made it. My next pick is Mountain West JSConf again. I picked it last week. I'm going to keep picking it because the call for proposals is open right now. It's a JavaScript conference in March in Salt Lake City. 2 days. It's going to be cheap. It's going to be very low key and focused on great technical content and to fill your brain to bursting with smart ideas. So submit talks, and I hope to see you there. Those are my picks.
I want to pile on that one just for a second because I'm also involved with, helping Mike get some of the planning and stuff done for that. Mike Moore has put on Mountain West Ruby Conference for the past 6 years, I think. And he's added the JavaScript track this year. He added the DevOps track last year, if you're interested in that. And it's all 1 week. For all three, if you want to go to that, or just the JavaScript for the 2 days. He tries to keep the cost way down, and he tries to keep the technical content really high and really high quality. So, as Jameson said, I mean, this is just going to be I can't say that because we have family rating. I almost said anyway, but it's going to be an awesome conference. So seriously, help support us. If you have people that you want to hear speak, then send me an email and I'll pass that along to Mike so we can invite some of these people that you want to hear from. And come out. I'll be there. Sounds like a lot of these other guys will be there because it's out here in Salt Lake. And
I'll be there.
Super excited about it. All right, Merrick, what are your picks?
So my picks are one, a book that's actually a novel called The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, I think. I hope I didn't butcher his name too badly. But it's just a really interesting book, and it's one of those books that makes you think a lot. I really like it. In fact, yesterday I was reading the book, and I was thinking all pensively, and I asked a pensive question on Twitter. I was like, what makes a great software developer? And no one took my question seriously, which took me right out of that pensive state of mind,
Like, you're too good for this world.
When a mom and a dad get together, you know what I mean? Like, I was like, dang it, guys, like, I want to have, like, an interesting conversation by a fireplace, but Twitter just isn't the avenue for that, I suppose. But anyways, that book. 2 is Rust language. I've been playing with it the last few weeks, and I think it strikes a really awesome balance between nice syntax and a really powerful low-level language. I think it's got the best of chances at sort of replacing C and C++, if that is ever a thing. And I am super looking forward to Mountain West Ruby Conference, and I am also organizing NGConf. So if you're interested in that, we have a waiting list, and hit me up on Twitter, and we'd love to see if we can get more people to come. So that's ng-conf.org.
Awesome. All right, I've got a bunch of picks. The first one is this Saturday they are releasing the 50th anniversary episode of Doctor Who. It's called The Day of the Doctor. And since this comes out next week, it was totally awesome. If you didn't see it, go see it. They have a prequel out on YouTube right now. It's about 7 or 8 minutes long, and it kind of introduces what they're calling the War Doctor, who I guess is a previous incarnation of the Time Lord known as the Doctor. But anyway, they explained why he doesn't disrupt the numbering of the Doctors, even though he's from the past, or the Doctor's past. So anyway, it's going to be fun. I love the show, so I'm really, really excited to see it come out. My next pick was something that Josh Susser on the Ruby Rogues podcast pointed out, and it's the reviews on these sugar-free gummy bears on Amazon. And so you have to understand that lowbrow humor, I'm not a sophisticated guy, lowbrow humor such as potty humor is something that makes me laugh. And so these sugar-free gummy bears apparently have some gastrointestinal consequences if you eat them. And some of these reviews are downright funny. Some of them are poetic. It's just, I was laughing and laughing and laughing. So anyway, I can't say this enough, but go check out these gummy bears and scroll down to the reviews because they are funny. I've also read a book, or I listened to a book on Audible called Remote, and it's written by the guys at 37 Signals. And it's really awesome if you work from home, or if you're on a remote team, or you're trying to convince your boss to let you go and work remote part or all of the time. It's a terrific book, and it explains some of the things that you need to do, need to have, and need to know in order to provide infrastructure for that. But anyway, I have some subcontractors that work for me, and I'm a freelancer, so I don't have a boss that I necessarily report to, but it gave me a lot of good ideas for the way that I do things. So I'm going to recommend that one. And the last one, this Monday, I've had type 2 diabetes for the last 6 or 7 years, and I went to the doctor on Monday, and it turns out that all of my diabetes is way out of control, which is why I hadn't been feeling good lately. And so I just want to pick being healthy. And there's a book out there called The Healthy Programmer by Joe Kuttner. Super good book, and I just want to recommend that you go read it. Freelancer Show, we actually did an episode and interviewed Joe, and it was pretty good too. But overall, just be mindful of your health. Programming is fun. Making a living is important. But if you don't have your health, then, you're really going to miss out. So those are my picks. Robin, what are your picks?
Oh, it's hard to follow that, which I totally agree with. I mentioned earlier Alex Smachner's slides about Angular versus Ember, which I think is the best one I've seen so far. I think better than my blog post about the subject, so I have to pick that. My second pick would be Blizzard's new upcoming game, Hearthstone, which is in closed beta right now. But it's closed beta, but it's like 1 million people are in the beta, so pretty much anyone who's made a slight effort to get a key can get one. But I play that right now every day, pretty much at the end of the business day. My coworker Neil and I play 2 rounds of Hearthstone because it's so much fun. And I really regret that it's region locked because I can't play with Regis or other coworker in Europe because they won't let us play together. But if you guys like games like Magic the Gathering, this is a free to play online card game, and it's awesome. So I highly recommend that. And then my third thing, so do picks have to be good? Or can it be like Times Man of the Year, where it's like notorious?
It can be.
Oh, it can be notorious.
Whatever. Yeah,
it's up to you.
Okay. So I'm gonna pick.
I picked crack once, so it's weird.
Well, that's funny that you mentioned that because I was gonna pick Rob Ford, Toronto's crack smoking mayor, as my third.
Oh man,
which has put Toronto, where I'm proudly from, on the map. So he's my pick for making a mockery of the city.
So I follow you on Twitter, and I feel like I've got the inside scoop on it because I've been hearing about it from all your tweets for weeks and months, and now it's like blowing up. I was there when Rob Ford drunkenly called that radio station.
It just gets worse.
So good.
It's like I've heard in other countries politics are like this, but I guess in Canada we're not really used to having like tabloid style, like every day there's something that goes on. So it's just been an insane thing that's taken up a lot of my thinking, even though I really dislike it, but it's there. So that's my third pick.
You need to move to Chicago or New York City, man.
Yeah.
Dude, Arnold Schwarzenegger was a governor, so that doesn't tell you how tabloid we get up here.
But he didn't smoke crack and admit to it, and is still mayor.
He was more discreet.
Yeah,
that's true. It wasn't smoking crack.
His biggest scandal was he fathered a illegitimate child with his housekeeper or something, right? So,
crack
that we know of. Maybe he's got bigger scandals.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's an awesome pick.
Thanks a lot for having me, guys. Though it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was a great discussion.
Thanks for coming on.
All right, well, we'll wrap up the show. We'll catch y'all next week.